leaving millions in fuel poverty. And in the fifth richest country on earth, people are having to choose between heating and eating. It's frankly just appalling and an utter disgrace. And meanwhile, of course, oil and gas companies are bragging that their companies are like cash machines. They're making such huge profits. So tonight, we're going to look at the alternatives to our privatized and polluting energy system that's left people with unaffordable energy bills and that frankly is nowhere near fit for purpose to deal with the challenge of the climate emergency that we face. There's huge public support for a different way of running our tax and energy, running our energy system based on public ownership, windfall taxes on fossil fuel giants, a shift from expensive fossil fuels to renewables, and a mass program of home insulation that can save people hundreds of pounds per year and create tens of thousands of jobs, of course. And tonight we'll be addressing these issues, these alternatives to our current system that's run for corporate greed and not for public good. So all our events in the Socialist Campaign Group are bringing together parliamentarians who've taken the lead on these issues, as well as key thinkers and activists. And tonight we have three really fantastic guests. I'm going to introduce them all, although I don't think one of them is quite with us yet, but I'm sure she will be. So our first speaker will be Jon Trickett MP, who's done lots of excellent work on the need for public ownership and on targeting the profiteering of so many companies. Our second speaker will be Dickard MP, who is a community organiser and campaigner who works on the New Economic Foundation's Great Homes Upgrade campaign, as well as organising with renters' unions across the UK. And our third speaker will be Hobbs, the director of whom I'm sure you've heard of We Own It, the campaign for public services to be run for people and not for profit. So we'll hear from each of them in turn, and then we'll have a round of questions and answers. It may be that Jon has to leave just before the end, but for that reason, he's going to have 15 minutes to start with. So if you've got any questions, put them in the Q&A function, and I will make sure that I get to ask those at the end of our speakers' input. So, Jon, over to you. The floor is yours. I think you're still muted, but yeah.
I think somebody muted me and I forgot to demute myself, so apologies. Yeah, it's great to have so many people joining these seminars. We think they are important. First of all, for you to get to know us, to meet us. Secondly, for us to work together with great organisations like NEF and We Own It and many others too, the trade unions and so on. And to listen to, the views which you have about these matters. And we do want to build a movement. I mean, a movement is what this is all about. But it starts with ideas in many ways. Ideas and organisation together can help to build a movement. Let me, before I just get into the subject though, pay tribute to Christine and all of the others who are in the Lords, who are members of the campaign group. It's one of the many interesting legacies of Jeremy's leadership that we now have members of the Lords who are absolutely brilliant comrades, working hard I'm sure you would all be very proud of the work that they are doing, and we're proud that they're part of our team. So what I'm going to, clearly there's a range of expertise amongst the three of us. I want to focus on this idea of a windfall tax, but as you'll see, as I begin to unravel it, the argument, it does lead to some quite big, interesting conversations, I think. And a windfall tax has been proposed as we know, by the Labour front bench. What they've been calling for is a tax on what they call the super profits of the energy companies. And the purpose of raising that money is to cut bills to households across the country. And as we've just heard, and as we all know, there is great misery right across communities with the situation which people now find themselves in. Now, it's quite interesting, and it may not be well known, to discover that there have been windfall taxes in the past. Those of us of my age, I won't speak about anybody else on the panel, will recall perhaps that New Labour had a windfall tax. And what's interesting, maybe to compare with what we've got from the leadership, our current leadership, is what the Blair government had in mind, because what they did was, those who remember will know, they had a tax on the excess profits of all of those utilities which are being privatised. Now, what's interesting about that, it raised £5 billion, by the way. But what's interesting about it was how the money was then used. And it wasn't simply to cut people's expenditure. It was more fundamental and radical than that. The windfall tax, devised largely, I think, in the Treasury, was a one-off tax, but it was used to fund what was then called the New Deal. It was a program to get the long-term unemployed. Remember, there were many long-term unemployed after the Thatcher years and major years, to get them back to work by long-term investment. And the windfall tax was also used to invest in schools. Christine will remember some of the investment, and also to create the University for Industry. So it's quite interesting. These were attempts to restructure, perhaps at the margins, the way in which capitalism was working. We can go further back than Blair. We can go back to Mrs. Thatcher, who you might be surprised to hear, though some of us do remember it. She also had a windfall tax. And it was the then Chancellor, Geoffrey Howe, who introduced it back in, I think, 1881. And what they did was they imposed a windfall tax on the North Sea oil and also on the banks. And it was quite a significant amount of money that was raised by that. Now, how did she use the money? Well, in part at least, the aspiration of the Thatcher government was to use the money from the windfall tax to privatise public services, particularly energy and so on. Now, that is a very interesting thought, because if a windfall tax could be used, I don't know, by Blair to begin to restructure unemployment, and if a windfall tax might be used by Geoffrey Howe and Mrs. Thatcher to reconstruct the economy, to privatise services which had been in the public sector, then it does raise an interesting, if somewhat subversive, thought in our minds. And I'm going to come to that in a minute or two. But let's just remind ourselves that the privatisation of the energy sector effectively has led to six companies: British Gas, EDF, E.ON, Npower, Scottish Power, SSE, and so on. More than £3 in every 4 in the household energy market was going through those companies. So privatisation effectively became private monopolies. But what's very interesting, I'm sure that many of you already know this, is that EDF is a subsidiary of the French state. E.ON and Npower are controlled from Germany. Scottish Power is controlled from Spain. Privatisation, in fact, put significant parts of the economy and the energy sector into the hands of the states, but not the British state. Now, some people might argue, well, it doesn't really matter where a company is owned, where its headquarters is, because we live in a global world and we're international and so on. I'm not sure I follow that argument. It seems to me when it comes to crucial infrastructure and services such as energy supply, as we now know, we can be left extremely vulnerable to fluctuations in the market, and in a way which in other countries isn't the case. Now, let me just now, apart from having referred to who owns the energy producers, turn for a second to thinking about what the record of private ownership has been. And I think we're all clear in our minds that in terms of green criteria, the depredation of our planet, private ownership has been a complete failure. The market doesn't work in that way. It requires state direction on behalf of the wider public interest. That isn't achieved in a marketplace, especially where the energy sector is largely owned by people who are not necessarily subject to British laws. But I want to focus on the issue of price. But I don't want to dismiss the green issues. Now, privatisation has a direct impact on price. There have been studies, detailed academic studies and others, examining the UK energy market. And they've all concluded one thing, which is that electricity prices in the UK are 10 to 20% higher than they would otherwise have been if Thatcher hadn't privatised using a windfall tax to help to privatise it. 10 to 20% higher. And also other research has been done to look at energy systems in countries where public ownership has been retained. And we mustn't fool ourselves or allow ourselves to be fooled into thinking that somehow or another the whole world has got neoliberal energy markets. It certainly hasn't. But in countries where public ownership is retained, generally on the average, you can say that the prices are 20 to 30% lower than they are in the UK. So those two facts are very, very significant, it seems to me. And the question we have to ask then is why? Why should it be that private ownership produces higher prices than public ownership? And I think there are a range of answers. Well, I don't want to go through them all. The cost of the market and so on and so forth all adds price. All adds price to the cost of energy. But I think the single most important factor is the question of shareholder value. Now, a research by Commonwealth has shown that oil and gas companies have handed out almost £200 billion to their shareholders since 2010. £200 billion, money which, if the industry would have been in the public sector, would have been used to either keep prices down or to invest in greener energy, or both. If you look at Shell and BP together, they've handed over £147 billion since 2010 to rewarding shareholders. These are colossal amounts of money which ought to belong to us. And therefore, it brings me back to this thought that, ironically, that Mrs. Thatcher, our enemy, had, that you could use a windfall tax on super profits to restructure the economy. Now, let me just give you the figures, because I think they're interesting. 20 million people in our country are being pushed into fuel poverty, 1 in 3 in Yorkshire. And so it seems to me a windfall tax to reduce prices is no more than a temporary fix. It's like an elastoplast on a gaping wound. The truth is that the whole shambles of the energy market, private ownership of the sector, are rigged in such a way that they operate against both the national interest, but also the consumer interest too. So, you know, it seems to me not simply an ideological position, though many of us will have that, but it's also a pragmatic one. How to respond to the crisis which so many families are facing with prices. And I think you can fiddle around if you want, and it's not, I don't argue with the idea that we should try to use prices by a windfall tax. But the truth is, in the end, you're going to have to finish the energy market and put an end as well to private ownership. Why shouldn't we use the very technique that Thatcher had, part using a windfall tax from the very companies in order then to bring them back into public ownership. Now, there's just one final point, if I've got time, Christine,
Yep.
which we ought not to ignore. And this is the politics of all this, because the energy producers have penetrated themselves almost into every single pore in the body politic. Our politics, our state institutions, even our parliament are penetrated through and through by representatives of the industry. I think over £1 million in donations from the energy sector to the Tories. When you can now explore the Tory ministers' diaries, those diaries which are kept to date, by the way, which are not so many, there have been 9 times more meetings with fossil fuel companies with Tory ministers than there have been with Tory ministers and clean energy companies. And then it's not to mention, if you look through the Tory registers of interest, maybe other party members, MPs and Lords too. I'm not defending anybody who does it, but you will find literally dozens of donations, shareholdings, salaries, gifts, tickets to sporting and cultural events from fossil fuel companies, from petro states, aviation companies, climate skeptics. They're all in there. You only need to go through the MPs and the Lords members of interest. And so, though I think we can fund the public ownership in the way I've described and others too, taking back those private corporations into the public sector will be a fight. It'll be a fight by entrenched forces which are entrenched into the parliament itself, but it's a fight for democracy against the interests of oligarchy. But it's a fight, I think, that's worth having. And thanks for listening.
That's a great opening. Thanks very much, Jon. And you conclude on that point about it's a fight. Well, you know, as Ian Lavery always says to us, they don't call it the struggle for nothing.
Oh, absolutely.
That's the division bell going off. But I can stay at my seat and vote because we have modern systems in the Lords. So I'm just gonna introduce Kat to make the second intervention while I have a look at my phone and vote down some awful aspects of the elections bill. Okay, so Kat, I introduced you earlier, and I think that your remarks will follow on extremely well from Jon's. So Kat, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christine, and thanks for organising this. Everyone who's been involved, it's great to be part of it. Good luck with the voting. I've got a few slides which I'm hoping I can share. Let's see if this works. Just to say, to start with, I'm Kat Hobbs. I'm the director of We Own It. We campaign for public ownership, we've put together a sort of explainer of how we think energy could be run in public ownership and how that would help with the cost of living crisis. So I'm going to talk about the 4 things that we think should happen. But I've been asked to talk about community ownership too, which is obviously super important. It's not such a core thing for us, but I really want to highlight a way forward on that front and a campaign that is doing really great work on that front too. So I'll be talking a bit about public ownership and a little bit about community ownership of energy as well. So I'm going to try and share my slides. Let's just check that this will work. Great. So this, hopefully you can all see my slides. Let me know if not. So Jon has covered a lot of this already, but I'm hoping to just delve a bit deeper into some of these things that we could do if we actually wanted to run energy for people rather than profit. As we've talked about, we have this horrendous situation, 20 million people at risk of fuel poverty. It's really a crisis, and we need to be looking at radical, serious solutions that would actually shift things in a big way. So we're calling for a permanent windfall tax at the same level as Norway on oil and gas companies. We're calling for a new state-owned renewable energy company. We think that transmission and distribution of energy needs to be brought into public ownership, and we think there ought to be a publicly owned supply company to provide the energy that people need. So that's like kind of the 4 stages of the energy process: generation, transmission, distribution, and supply. Energy is quite complicated, and that's part of why it's difficult for us, I think, on the left to put forward these solutions, because bringing energy into public ownership isn't a simple, straightforward thing. There are lots of different elements of the system, and we have to do the work of explaining to people how it works and what could happen at every stage in order to provide a kind of comprehensive solution. So that's what we've tried to do in our petition, and I'll share the link to that, which hopefully also functions as a bit of an explainer. So the first thing that ought to be happening, as Jon talked about, is a windfall tax. And I think when we think about this, Commonwealth's research looking at the huge profits of BP and Shell, it's just astonishing. And it doesn't have to be this way. And so if we look at how Norway does this, this graph shows the difference between the UK and Norway in terms of how much tax we take per barrel of oil. So just like Norway, we've got lots and lots of oil and gas, but for every £100 that Norway collects in tax, we in the UK collect £8. So Norway has a corporation tax of 22% plus a special ongoing tax of 56%. It's a permanent windfall tax. And that means, as I say, they're collecting £100 for every £8 we're collecting. So of course, we need to be stopping drilling altogether. We need to be moving to sustainable energy. But if we are allowing these oil and gas companies like Shell and BP to operate in our waters, why on earth are we taxing them so little when that amount of money, £150 billion could be used to cut people's bills dramatically? And what they've done in Norway is they developed their hydropower, so 98% of their energy is renewable already. Then they set up Statoil and a sovereign wealth fund. What that means in practice is that they are paying 80% of people's bills above a capped price. So while we're seeing our bills increase, in a way that is, absolutely destroying people's lives, in Norway, over a capped price, 80% of it's paid by the government. That's the kind of thing that we could be doing if we actually cashed in on our oil and gas wealth and made corporations pay proper tax. So that's the first thing that we think should happen. And it should be a permanent windfall tax, and it should be at the same rate as Norway. Labour's proposal is good and is a step in the right direction, but it should be, at a higher level than they're talking about, I think. The next thing that we're calling for is a new state-owned renewable energy company to drive forward the green transition. So this diagram shows how much of our offshore wind is owned by the UK public. It's a tiny, tiny proportion. And what we're seeing is that publicly owned companies from other countries are going ahead and developing renewables. And that's something that we could do too. So, for example, Norway, again, owns a company called Statkraft. It's the largest renewables generator in Europe. It is publicly owned. Denmark owns 50% of Ørsted, which used to be called Dong Energy. That is the world's largest developer of offshore wind power. This is the kind of thing that we could be doing in the UK if we had a little tiny bit of imagination. We could have something like Energy for Britain that is a state-owned company. It could be creating jobs, it could be boosting communities, and of course it could be helping us move away from fossil fuels and towards a greener future at a faster rate. Other countries like Norway and Denmark do it. Why don't we do it too? And that would mean, the profits would flow back to this country, creating, more wealth, more jobs, all of those benefits would come to us. So yes, we should be looking at what these other countries are doing, and we should be copying them. The next thing I want to talk about is transmission and distribution. So this is really, really important. And obviously, when Labour was calling for full, for public ownership of energy, this was something it was talking about. This isn't something that's being talked about at the moment, but it is absolutely crucial. So a quarter of your bill right now is going to what are called network costs. And network costs is transmission and distribution. So that's taking the energy from where it's generated down the power lines and then onwards to your home. And we choose to do that using private companies, private monopolies. That's a really unusual way of doing it. And it means that we are wasting money on shareholders that we don't need to be wasting. So if you look at the grid, the transmission grid, we're one of the only countries in Europe that runs its whole transmission grid in private ownership by National Grid, which isn't what it sounds like, which is a private company. And their shareholders received £1.4 billion in dividends last year. That's money that could have been reinvested in cutting our bills or investing in renewable energy. Similarly, the distribution of energy is run by a handful of private monopolies, and they are owned by shareholders around the world. So if you're in the Northeast, for example, your electricity is delivered to your home by Northern Power Grid. That's the name of the company. And that company is owned by Warren Buffett, who I'm sure many of you will know is a US billionaire. If you're in London, the Southeast or the East of England, your electricity is brought to you by UK Power Networks. And that is owned by a billionaire Hong Kong owner, Li Ka-shing, who received a £237 million dividend for the second year in a row last year. So we don't own our energy transmission or distribution, but if we did, we would save £3.7 billion a year, and that's all money that could go back into cutting our bills, improving the system. So we think these private monopolies should be working for us, should be owned by us, not for shareholders. The fourth thing that we think should happen, and by the way, that amount of money, for example, £3.7 billion a year, is enough to buy 222 new offshore wind turbines. So this is serious money that could make a serious difference to how our energy system works. The fourth thing is the supply, so the company that you actually buy your energy from. So right now, the supply market is in complete chaos. Many of you will know about the collapse of Bulb, because Bulb is quite a big company with, I want to say 1.6 million customers, I think. The government has propped it up with £1.7 billion loan to make sure that the company stays afloat. And there was a story in the news today saying that even though we're having this public taxpayer bailout of Bulb, the CEO of Bulb is still earning £250,000. So he's doing very nicely out of it. So what we're seeing is that the government is in the middle of an energy crisis, propping up failing companies in a completely chaotic market, when what it could be doing is using the opportunity to create a publicly owned supply company that is the default provider for people. That could be a company that we know doesn't rip us off, that is investing in renewable energy, that is make sure it has enough reserves to deal with the fluctuations in global prices. And by the way, it's a completely normal way of doing things in other countries. So in Germany, in France, in Italy, this is what happens. So in Germany, 2/3 of people have municipally owned electricity. In France, 2/3 of people get their energy from EDF, which we heard about earlier, which is 80% state owned. And what the French government has decided is that, yes, we've got an energy crisis. They have a state-owned energy supply company. And so energy bills won't rise more than 4%. Very, very different from the situation that we're in. So we see, these aren't crazy radical ideas. They might feel outside of the debate that we're having in this country, But in France, energy bills going up by 4%. In Norway, people's bills, 80% of them being paid for above a capped price. People are actually getting help from their government to manage the global circumstances. That's something that we could be doing too. And we need to be talking about that, because these aren't radical ideas. They are normal ideas, and we need to be shifting the range of debate on this and shouting about this loudly, because this crisis is only going to get worse for people. I will end on a positive note, however. So I just want to draw your attention to this campaign, which is called Power for People. They are pushing for a local electricity bill. Excuse me. And they've got the support of over 300 MPs, so cross-party support, Conservative MPs supporting this bill. And what this is about is that at the moment, the UK has a really disastrous record on community energy. So the community energy sector currently only accounts for less than 0.5% of UK electricity generating capacity. So the reason for this is basically because if you want to set up energy supply locally, if you want to, put solar panels on a building and use that to supply people locally with electricity, essentially you can't, because you're being hit with really high setup and transaction costs that make it just impossible. It's just unworkable. And so what that means is that we don't have lots of local community-owned suppliers, as opposed to, again, other countries. So in Germany, there are 1,000 supply companies, whereas we have about 50 in the UK. And similarly in Germany, their larger utilities only control about 40% of the market. So you really need to be allowing communities, when they're looking at the climate crisis, they're looking at the cost of living crisis, they're wanting to do something to reduce their bills, to tackle climate change, and they're wanting to deliver, and develop and invest in community ownership of energy. We need to make that possible for them. And so this bill is really common sense. It's about a reform to the energy market. It's quite technical, but actually it's about enabling local community power. And this is something that could actually happen. So do write to your MP about it, ask them to back it, and we can actually get some change on that. But also, I hope you'll shout about all of the solutions that I've just talked about, because we have to be shifting the debate on this. And we have to have energy working for people rather than profit. Thank you.
Kat, that's great. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. So, if you only remember two things that Kat said, you could remember the stark contrast between here and Norway. And you can remember that you can have state-owned energy in this country, just that you can't have it owned by the British state. It has to be owned by the French state, which is just madness. Okay, so now we're going to move to our third speaker, whom I introduced earlier. I'm delighted, Aydin, to give you the floor.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. Hi, everyone. My name is Aydin. I'm an organizer at the New Economics Foundation, which is a progressive think tank, but since the 1980s has been trying to kind of rethink how our economic settlement could be more just. And over 10 years ago, NEF was part of a kind of group of organizations that called for something called a Green New Deal after the 2008 financial crisis, which is, of course, a phrase that we all know, we're all aware of. It's kind of common lexicon now. And I mention this because the kind of policies and politics of a Green New Deal are now criticized as costing too much, as being somehow kind of outside or damaging to working people's lives and needs. It's just for hippies. So it's important to remember that these were ideas that came about in the face of recession and poverty and the unemployment caused by the financial crash. And where critics of the Green New Deal are right is that it still remains a fairly abstract kind of notion. Like your average person on the street might not understand, what the concrete material of it is. It's got something to do with the climate, but not really understand what the demand is, what the context is. And this is what polling shows too. And this is precisely why a year ago, NEF started to focus in on retrofitting. And by that, I mean the measures we take to make our homes warmer. So things like insulation, double glazing, clean heat alternatives away from gas. Because for us, retrofitting is a kind of crucial linchpin in how you move from green policies being seen as something that takes away from your quality of life to something that gives back and improves it. And I think in the current crisis, this is essential. So, what do I mean by this? Well, if I speak to my mates about green policies, they can often roll their eyes. They're going to think I'm talking about taking away their holidays, their way of life, their meat. Our political enemies have kind of worked this out, right? The defining feature of the current climate struggle is no longer the fault lines of climate change being real or not, but whether the solutions are affordable for everyday people. This is the main thrust of the Net Zero Scrutiny Group, which I can come on to later. So it's with this in mind that NEF has started to work on retrofit, which we see as a kind of tangible, programmatic vision of what a Green New Deal could look like, that is understandable to the public. They know what insulation is, we know what a heating system is. And also people are more aware than ever that they need to keep their homes warm, and they're not managing to. And kind of at the same time, it's one of those kind of golden green policies because it has a whole range of things that are going to make people's lives better, be it just being warm, but also getting rid of the kind of scourge of damp. It puts money back in people's pockets. It's going to create thousands of jobs. It can create and support local businesses. It improves public health outcomes and so on. It's increasingly real for people. The current fuel crisis is increasingly real for people. We're talking about 40 million people now as the estimated projection of people that are going to be really feel, not 20 million into fuel poverty, but 40 million people. That's a big coalition starting to feel the pinch from what's happening. I think about this a lot because my line manager at NEF is an organizer called Mike, and his partner is from Finland. She lives in the UK with him because she moved here, but they always argue about the thermostat, right? They always argue about how much heating to put on because she's used to living in a warm home. She finds it remarkable how tolerant the British public is to living in damp, cold, drafty homes. And I kind of mention this because I think it's important for us to kind of break with the kind of tradition that we're used to of not being able to kind of expect better. And I think it's something that we can build a mass public demand for. And it's why we're calling our retrofit campaign, because retrofit is very technical, it's not particularly sexy. We're calling it the Great Homes Upgrade, because we're trying to tap into that kind of, that this is only going to happen, right, if people are starting to demand it from their politicians. It's also useful to mention Finland because they're leading the way when it comes to decarbonising housing, particularly on the side of kind of clean heating sources. They have a kind of proactive able to pay market, which means that they've got 2.7 million households now that there's 2.7 million households and about 1 million heat pumps that are kind of helping them out. And since 2000, the amount of energy used by Finnish households for heating has declined by about 15%. And that has come from state and public investment to support it along. If you compare that to the UK, it's striking. Heating in the UK, for instance, is 37% of total carbon emissions. It's the most stubborn area of carbon emissions that we haven't managed to reduce. Only 5% of homes in the UK have low carbon heating. 85% are still dominated by gas. Beyond just the clean heat and the issue around renewables and fossil fuels, this means like loads and loads of people having huge costs forced onto them, but also loads of people living in what we call EPC, and that's basically kind of jargon for how energy efficient someone's household is. Their EPC ratings are below C, which we think is the kind of standard which everyone in the UK should be allowed to and higher, to be honest. And if you think about the political decisions that have led to the kind of, the nature of the, British housing stock being some of the leakiest, coldest in Western Europe, in 2013, we had the Green Deal, which was meant to be a kind of conservative package that was going to help. And it reached just 15,000 people instead of its 14 million target, and then collapsed. The Zero Carbon Home Standard, which was scheduled for 2015, was binned by the incoming Conservative government. And the recent Green Homes Grant scheme, it reached just 5,800 people instead of its target 600,000 before, again, kind of collapsing. To be honest, part of that collapse was because so many people wanted it. There is an appetite for this because people don't want to live in cold, drafty homes, which are incredibly expensive. Select committee investigations have called these kind of schemes so far as botched, disastrous. The number of people insulating their homes between 2012 and 2019 has dropped by 95%. Right, that's crazy. That's precisely the decade in which we could have been insulating ourselves against the kind of fuel crisis that we're dealing with now. We wouldn't have to be dealing with this cost of living scandal. So according to the government's own statistics, only 34% of UK homes with a loft currently have no insulation whatsoever. So we've got like a third of people who are just leaking heat. Right. So how can we think about this kind of strategically? Well, firstly, this is work that has to be done. There is no path to net zero without retrofitting 19 million homes in this country, and we've set ourselves targets. So, the government will fail its own targets without tackling this. So in many ways, it's not a question of whether this is going to happen. It's going to happen, but it's a question of when and how. And these need to motivate us, because if the when is too late, we know the consequences in terms of climate, but we also now know the consequences in terms of like people's living conditions, the kind of huge poverty that could be forced on millions and millions of people. But also, just as Kat was talking about, there's a way of this becoming a national infrastructure plan, which actually ends up in the interest of big corporations, right? And is no different from a kind of George Osborne style failed green scheme in which you kind of have a Carillion model that just tears through the country. So NEF's roadmap for our Great Homes Upgrade is a way of trying to locate some of this work directly to local communities, right? So focusing on an area-based approach which empowers local authorities to be the kind of main providers of local supply chains, and a huge opportunity for kind of community wealth building to create thriving local industries, supply chains to do this work. The initial public investment, which we're asking for, is about 11.7 billion over this Parliament, and that is going to unlock the private finance necessary for this to scale up. This is a big amount of work, and people know that there's lots of opportunities here. Businesses want to get involved in this, but no one's going to jump first until there's a scheme. So our kind of main policy asks are that commitment of additional public investment of 11.7 billion over this Parliament, to create a fund and a national retrofit task. And I think this is crucial because the market does need to have confidence that this is going to be a serious long-term prospect. We've seen before with previous schemes that insulators, skilled workforces collapse, that unemployment happens because there's no commitment and confidence in the market. And it's the same problem we have in terms of training and skills. The thousands of jobs we could be unleashing with this work. You go to a training academy and say, are you teaching retrofit? Are you teaching how to do this kind of insulation and energy efficiency work? And they say, look, we'd love to, but we don't want to create jobs that don't exist yet. So we need that commitment of a national retrofit task force, with the aim of achieving at least an average EPC rating of C for all homes by 2030. Tax changes are going to be really important. We recently had a win on VAT treatment for retrofit works. It was in the spring statement. That was really good, but we need to kind of expand that out. So we've got a measure of kind of green-owned financial kind of asks that we want in terms of what the UK Infrastructure Bank can do, offer cheap finance to families and SMEs for upgrading their homes and buildings for the able-to-pay market. And with that public finance going directly into social housing first, because that's one principle really important. And then strengthening our building regulations. So, less demolition, making sure that whole house retrofits are feasible for homes. And again, focusing on that local authority model. But I think it's really important that, we're calling it the Great Homes Upgrade because we're trying to build a large and broad coalition on this, because we think the public are with us. Like, I think I think about my own life, living in a cold, damp home, having to put on, it's a memory that kind of still stays with me, either from being a student or actually when I was younger. When my parents got divorced, I remember it being cold. I remember, us having to, think about money and spending, and that's something that I think people all across the country feel, and there's a shame attached to it. And it's something that is unacceptable. Like, we should be demanding more. There's no way that people should be having to live in cold, damp homes when the figures, 11.7 billion, they're refurbishing Parliament for 12. That's 2 houses. We could be unlocking the potential to retrofit 19 million homes across the country. So this is a kind of program of work that could really be transformative and could make that Green New Deal seem tangible. Now, I think, Labour and the opposition have a very strong policy on this, but we need to champion it more. It needs to be known. Like, how many people on this call know that Labour are offering 6 billion a year for 10 years, a 10-year program at 60 billion pounds, 2 million homes retrofitted in the first year. That's stuff that we should be championing, because it's a real alternative to what the Conservatives are offering at the moment. And we have to force them to offer something more, because if we don't, by the time the winter comes around, people are really, really going to be struggling. So we need to, I think it's really important that we use the fantastic ideas that are floating around. We are kind of confident and proactive in arguing that this is possible. And I think it does speak to the government's agenda. You know, what could be more levelling up than doing this kind of work? What could be building back better? This is exactly the kind of program of work that speaks to that. And I think we have to build a very broad and large coalition in the general public, because I think people will want it once they know about it. So that's my kind of that's my, you know, if you want to get involved in the Great Homes Upgrade, I'll drop the website in the chat, and we're campaigning all over the country. We're going to be doing events up in Leeds hopefully soon. We did one outside of Parliament a few weeks ago, and there are local groups across the country as well. So thank you for inviting me, and good luck.
That's great, Odin. Thank you very much. I love that. You know, I mean, we do have to repeat policies, don't we? And I think just going around saying to people, who wants to live in a cold, damp home? I mean, that's just fantastic. Nobody wants to live in a cold, damp home, do they? Now, we may, John may have to go just before we finish. So I've got a couple of questions that are really specifically for John. So we'll take those. Then if either of the other two want to drop in anything on those, that's fine. And then I've got some others that are more specific for Kat and Aydin. So John, we're saying windfall tax, and we're kind of assuming that everybody specifically knows what a windfall tax is. So it'd be quite nice if you just give us, you know, just a couple of sentences on what a windfall tax is. Sure. And then also from one of our attendees from Birmingham, she doesn't say who her MP is, but she says that her MP says that if we take energy back into public ownership, we'll just have to compensate all the shareholders, and so we won't save any money. Well, you know, we know where compensating shareholders gets us to, don't we? But anyway, so just a couple of words on what a windfall tax specifically is, and then compensating shareholders. John, over to you.
Oh dear. Well, I'd like to know the identity of this MP who said that, because we could have a cup of tea.
Well, you never know. You never know. She may be prepared to tell us.
Yeah. So, well, look, it's very hard. It's very hard to make this case if you're not really in favour of capitalism as such. But it's arguably some sectors of the economy make what you might call super profits compared to the average company. And so the first thing is those companies which make super profits, by virtue of the fact of the way in which their company or their sector is structured, gives them a trading advantage, is then effectively getting super profits off the back of the arrangements which society has made for that particular sector. Now, we would argue that where you've got something which is almost a natural monopoly, as is energy, rail, and some of the others too, then some of those industries get massive advantages as a consequence. And the way in which Thatcher privatised the energy market, but also other public services as well, was done in a way to encourage shareholder investment by making super profits. So, what is a windfall tax? Well, a windfall, I think the origin of the word windfall comes from when the wind blows and the apples fall off the trees, and you go scrumping as a lad because you don't, you know, you want to get some apples or pears or whatever's fallen to the ground. It's a windfall. Now, so the word windfall tax came from that background. By fortune, good fortune or otherwise, some companies get a windfall profit much bigger than the average profitability for the rest of British capitalism. And the argument, therefore, is that they should be taxed. They should pay a super tax to go along with their super profits. That's really I suppose, the ethical and philosophical economic underpinning of the argument. Now, there's then to be a debate about what level do you set the tax at, but I'm not going to go into that, other than to say I gave the figures, I think, since 2010, between Shell, BP, and the big energy companies. 370 odd billion, I don't have the figures in front of me, but I read them out earlier, 370 odd billion pounds has gone from the super profits that they've been making to the shareholders. Now that money is a super profit, and it's going out of your pocket and mine if you're an energy consumer. And therefore, the argument has been made, well, we should tax them. There should be a windfall tax. Personally, as I've said, look, the front bench have made a case for a windfall tax to cut prices. I think if I can be explicit, I know we're being recorded, so I need to be careful what I say. But if I can just be explicit for a minute, the idea that we should have a windfall tax on super profits to reduce prices is a progressive idea, but it doesn't change the fundamentals which give those companies the super advantage which they've got compared to other sectors of the economy. So my view will be to use some of that tax at least to begin to restructure the thing. Now that's a bit of a long-winded answer to the first question. What was the second question? I lost my thread.
The second was, if we nationalise energy, we'd have to compensate shareholders, so we'd end up with no money.
Well, I think there are two parts of that. I've just given you the figures. I mean, for 8 companies, all of that money going back to the shareholders. The shareholders have been massively compensated by the fact that they're in a privileged position in a privileged industry, and arguably they've been overcompensated for the risk which they've taken. But in any event, as the argument is always a case, oh well, we can't afford this, we can't afford that. Listen, we live in the 5th richest country in the world by some calculations. We can't afford to run our public services for the public, owned by the public, then I'm damned, because we can. It's a question of political will. Who will decide the future of our economy, and in whose interest will it operate? Will it operate for the many or for the few? That was a central question which we posed, and which goes through Labour's history. That question, whether it's a dominant idea for the leadership at the present time or not, is a different question. But look, we can afford it. It can be done. It's a question of political will. Are you going to bow the knee to these people, or are we going to stand up tall and change our country so it works, so that people aren't living in gross poverty, children shivering, old people struggling to keep on going? What kind of country are we living in? That's a central question which we have to ask ourselves. There you are, Christine.
Great. Thank you thanks very much, John. That's great. Right, I've got a couple of other questions. One for Aydin, which is that someone's raised the issue of high utility costs being passed on to people with disabilities, for example, in residential care, pushing up care costs. What can be done in such buildings? I mean, I think you covered this, because basically this is not just about homes, it's about buildings. But do by all means say a few more things about that. And then Kat, I think people have heard your message, and we've even heard that actually, there are things that the Labour Party is planning to do. But the question is, how do we make sure this campaigning is going on to make sure that everybody's hearing those messages all the time? So either of you can have a go at either of those. And then just before we go off, I've got a question about nuclear power coming up. So Aydin and Kat, just a couple of minutes each on that, and John, if you want to, and then we'll come to something on nuclear power.
Great. So the first thing I'll say is that, focusing on housing, but there are also lots of measures, for public buildings is really important. Schools, making sure that, I would consider if it was I don't know if you said it was a home for elderly people, but that would count as a kind of home, right? It's really important that's precisely the kind of place that shouldn't be cold or damp. And when it comes to the public health benefits of this, massive. I think it's something like 14% of every pound that's spent on this, so 14p in every pound ends up going back to the NHS because of the implication it has on people's respiratory diseases. We did cold damp homes, and overcrowded cold damp homes are the reason why working class people are more likely to die from COVID, right? This is a really important issue. I want to caveat by saying that, you know, the Great Homes Upgrade, this is a long-term 10-year infrastructure project. And I think it's really important, but it has to come alongside immediate measures to protect people who are falling into fuel poverty and who will be falling into fuel poverty over this winter. And so alongside this large kind of structural package that we've come up with, we're obviously, linking up and in the coalitions with fuel poverty campaigners who are calling for things like uplifting universal credit, so that we can make sure people at the sharpest end are not immediately hit. I think when it comes to the broader piece around public campaigning, like, I think we have to put this into a language in which we can put real pressure on those backbench Conservative members of Parliament, many of whom, you know, will be in constituencies that have some of the lowest EPC rating of households, and say, look, if you are serious about levelling up, you know, you need to be pushing on this. And we've seen Bayes, the department, you know, Kwasi Kwarteng, has been trying to champion this work, and the block seems to be Treasury. Treasury really does not want to unleash any of the funds. So we have to understand that dynamic that's happening within the Conservative Party, and we need to build public pressure to, you know, to make sure that people understand that we will not live like this. We will not go through this. We are not going to have a winter like this. And we expect the next 10 years for you to transform this for us. And that's the kind of message that I think is really important to put out there. Be you in a care home, a council flat, a private renter, or you own your own home, you know, that's the coalition. And there's a lot, you know, that's everyone. So.
That's great. Thanks. Kat, do you want to come in on some of this?
Yeah, definitely. Just a quick response to add to what Jon said on the compensation point. Just specifically, so on the transmission and distribution. So yeah. In what we're putting forward, we'd have to buy that back, right? If we paid book value, i.e. what the shareholders put in for that, yes, that would cost money. Okay, so that would cost around £28 billion, right? However, we also make money because we then save £3.7 billion a year. So that investment pays for itself in 7.5 years, right? And that is a pretty good investment by any calculation. So are we going to allow shareholders to own our assets, to own our services, to rip us off and extract money indefinitely? Or are we going to make the investment necessary to end up with a situation where we, the people, end up with the benefit from assets that we should be owning in the first place, and that every other country in Europe already owns? Other countries in Europe already own their grids and their networks. For all of the other suggestions that we're making, it's a case of making money. You introduce a windfall tax, you make money. You create a new state-owned renewable company to drive forward the energy transition, you make money, you boost the economy, you create jobs. You create a new supply company so that when companies like Bulb collapse, you have an option available for the millions of customers who don't have anywhere to go. That is the smartest possible thing you could do. It doesn't cost you anything. Right now, the latest figure on what government's spending on that, up to £2 billion to prop up a private company. We are spending money. The government is spending money on propping up companies instead of, creating a structure that can take on customers as the market collapses. And by the way, just to pick up on that context, on the comment in the chat from Leslie about Robin Hood Energy and the collapse of Robin Hood Energy, we have had some experiments where we've had local publicly owned companies. They haven't been able to make it work. That's because they were too small, and it's really difficult. The energy market is a really difficult environment for any company to operate. That's why so many companies are collapsing right now. That's why we need something at scale that can really compete with the big six. And the government could do that. They could do that right now. It wouldn't cost them anything. In fact, it would save them money. So almost all of these proposals are straight away saving money, and buying back saves you money in the long run. So it's really a no-brainer. It's just that we've been fed all these messages about the cost of nationalisation, and we've been told all of this stuff in the media, which brings me on to the point about the Labour Party and how we get across this message. So I think we have to bang home the message about the waste of privatisation. We have to flip the script on this and flip the narrative on this, because, you know, the Labour Party's in this situation where they're so scared of you know, a repeat of the 2019 election, of being seen as doing something unaffordable. But actually, it's really unaffordable for us to be ripped off by shareholders at every turn, to be able to live, to be able to receive any basic services. We know that cost of living is going to be huge at the next election. It's going to be huge, you know, ongoingly for the next few years. You know, people are talking about, you know, there's possibly going to be riots in the streets in the summer. That's what's being predicted. You know, it's a very, although it feels like we're up against it politically, it's also a very unstable situation where anything could happen. So I think if we can get across the narrative that spending money on shareholders right now is a waste, you know, when we can't afford to, when people are choosing between eating and heating, and yet we're wasting this money on shareholders, I think that's a powerful way to go. And if people are in the Labour Party, you know, pushing motions to make that case that we shouldn't be wasting this money, I think is powerful.
Thanks very much. You can now hear the got off division bell. They were great answers. Now I'm not going to sidestep this because someone has raised the issue of nuclear as a question, but they've raised it in terms of saying, wouldn't it be cheaper and easier to just bring on nuclear rather than wind and wave and other types of renewables? And I have my own view about this. It's interesting that I think nuclear is something where there's often a divide on the left. I know quite good lefties who think nuclear is okay. I'm not one of them, but let me give it over to you. I mean, what do we think about nuclear in terms of the way forward for dealing with what clearly is a huge energy crisis? Jon, do you want to come in on this?
Well, I think I'm largely with you. You and I probably generationally maybe were part of the whole of the anti-nuclear movement, and there was a logic which is still strong today, which is that the cost of nuclear, we don't really know the longer term costs of nuclear. We simply do not know. All we know is that this is the toxic fuel is a byproduct of it, and there's no easy way of disposing of it, literally for centuries, probably for 1,000 years, and therefore it isn't easy to find a way of establishing the true cost of nuclear. Having said that, and therefore, you know, there's also obviously the risk of any instability at all producing really quite a devastating consequence. We saw what happened in Ukraine not too long ago. I'm afraid, you know, you are vulnerable, and it also takes years to build this stuff in any event. So I'm not convinced. I do know very good friends and comrades of mine who are distinguished environmentalists who have said, well, it's the only way to go. They haven't convinced me personally. And also, you know, I think there are lots of things we can be doing with immediate payback, including retrofitting and some of the other points that have been made by the other speakers, which could make a difference in the here and now. I mean, just one point perhaps that I'd like to make is that in my constituency, which is a former mining constituency, the Green New Deal doesn't have a great reputation. And it's complicated to say why that is, but people don't feel comfortable about it. But if we were to say to people, as I do, well, if we can insulate your house or the street, we're going to reduce your bills, and what's going to employ your kids and grandkids, because this is not complicated work, but it will be well-paid, remunerated work and long-term work. You're offering something in the here and now. And so a lot of the discussion tonight has been about how we produce energy. I think the most important bit is probably, you know, some of the comments which have been made about how we save energy, and certainly trying to deal with our building stock is something we could do in the here and now. Whereas nuclear, it's a long-term thing. It will be privately owned. And God knows what the shareholders will want the payback to be if we go down the nuclear track. But there you are, that's my view.
Thanks, John. Well, we'll now see if this is a generational thing or not. And when we come to Kat and Aydin to see what they've got to say about nuclear, bearing in mind that the question presupposes, the way it's put, that it would be quicker and easier than it would be to bring in renewables. And I have to say, I think there's a significant challenge to that. Anyway, Aydin.
I mean, what I'd say is that, you know, the Climate Change Committee and National Infrastructure Commission they've crunched the numbers, right, on net zero, and they concluded that the UK doesn't need more than 2 large nuclear reactors, which includes Hinkley Point C. But obviously the new security strategy offered 7. You know, I think this is a bit of it's a kind of distraction, and it's an easy techno fix, which is often what politicians quite like, right? They quite like the idea that there'll be this magical, but I mean, incredibly expensive in terms of the cost. You know, the cost of nuclear is rising compared to renewables, particularly on energy storage. So I'm not against nuclear in terms of like the principle of us having an alternative to fossil fuels, but it's more kind of much more strategic and pragmatic in the sense that with the state of renewables at the moment, like the last thing we need is a giant distraction of 7 nuclear power plants, when we could be investing that money into, you know, fabric first retrofit of homes, but also like, you know, heat pumps. You know, like the technology that exists is really effective, would have a massive impact on our household carbon emissions. So I think it's not even necessarily that there's a problem with the kind of the principle of nuclear. It's much more to do with like the practical reality of it, and this being a kind of a distraction to something that could be much easier and also probably cleaner.
Okay, that's great, thanks. And Kat, do you want to have the last word on this?
Yeah, not really. We don't particularly take a position, and I really agree with what Aydin just said. So yeah.
Okay. Well, I think we're more or less out of time now. So on behalf of those of you who told us where you were listening from, Romford, Portugal, Southampton and Basingstoke, I'm sure there were other places represented, but they're the ones that have appeared in my list. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. There wouldn't really have been a webinar if you hadn't joined us, and on your behalf, I also thank John and Aydin and Kat for their brilliant presentations. And I think the key takeaway from this evening is that we have to make sure that people kind of understand this stuff. You know, some of it is very complicated, some of it's much less complicated, but basically the key messages are the ones that we have to get through. We can afford this. There is a better way of organizing an energy market, i.e. not a privatized market, but just one that's, you know, municipal and state owned. And who wants to live in a cold, damp home? Certainly not me. So that's fantastic. And so with that, I thank you very much. And I hope you have a chance to look at this again, make sure that you get all the key messages, look at the other ones, and join us in future for yet another brilliant Socialist Campaign Group webinar. Thank you very much and good night.